scholars. Today we're going to begin a three-part lecture series on the Canaanites. This is part one. We're looking at an overview of the chronology behind Canaanite civilization from the end of the Neolithic up to 1150 BC. The next two lectures will be sort of narrowing our focus on the city-state of Ugarit to see how their mythological texts relate to the Bible. Looking at the origins of religion in the ancient Near East, meaning bovine cult and ancestor skull worship coming from the beginning of urban life in previously pastoral cultures based on the use of herd animals as a way of life. Okay, so my lectures on Ugarit show how traces of this early religion can be found in later mythological texts and in the Israelite religion of the Old Testament. Okay, so we have two parts to this religion: the ancestor skull worship and the bovine structure of the god's pantheon. Okay, the first one is this idea of a bovine structure to the pantheon is not new. There are bovine cults in Egypt where they worship the god Hathor, in Babylon where they worship Ninurta, who was the mythological mother of Gilgamesh. She suckled him so that he would become a giant and extremely strong. And of course in India they have the sacred cow Hinduism. Now, Canaanite culture can not be viewed as sort of encapsulating all the land of Canaan. Identities at this point were extremely regional and involved in the city-state as the locus. So we have no sources to tell us how this culture regarded itself, sort of names and identities in history, or what it called itself, only regional identities and what foreign powers thought of them and the labels that they put on this culture. So again, the foreigner, what the discovery of Ugarit changed is this idea of foreigners being the only way of understanding Canaanite culture. The discovery of Ugarit is essentially the only major source of text and identity for Canaanite regional cultures. Scholars today use Canaanite as a period marker for everything before the Iron Age, and Phoenician from everything from the dawn of the Iron Age to the siege of Nebuchadnezzar, and Punic from the late 6th century BC to the Third Punic War in 146 BC. Now, before moving on, we should cover what the Bible's place in Canaanite archaeology is. Now, scholars are divided, and basically the way it breaks down is this. You have a dividing line representing the Babylonian exile from 585 BC to 545 BC. Now scholars who defend the thesis that the Bible was written primarily after the exile also tend to view the Bible as less historically reliable than those who place the Bible as being majority written before the Babylonian exile. Now, let's begin. Summary of Bronze Age Canaanite history. The majority of Canaanite settlements in the early Bronze Age did not have the signs of centralization to indicate city-state status. Right? It took a while for these regional identities to develop because of the structure of city-states takes time. Therefore, they tended to be trade hubs, the largest of which was the port of Byblos. The largest trading partner was Egypt during this time, as evident by the massive amount of Canaanite pottery that has been discovered at Abydos, and which dates to the first dynasty, so around 3000 BC. We'll see routinely throughout history as Egyptian influence on the culture grows and wanes, depending on their power in the land of Canaan as their colony. Therefore, the collapse of the Old Kingdom and the loss of its market it caused mean that by 2400 BC, many of these trade hubs have become deserted. This effect was most pronounced and frequent in southern Canaanite settlements, those that were closer to Egypt. The dominant theory tends to be that the settlers in the area were not conquered, but that they were simply forced to return to a pastoral or semi-nomadic lifestyle. In the northern Canaanite settlements, there are only indications of a recession, and the markets shifted from Egypt to certain cities in Syria. For example, the practice of keeping family tombs continued after 2400 BC for several centuries, according to excavations at Megiddo, showing that the urban population was comparatively more stable in the north. After Pharaoh Ahmose expelled the Hyksos from Egypt, that would be about the 16th century BC, the Egyptians began a series of vigorous campaigns in Canaan to prevent any Asiatic power from achieving dominion over Egypt again. Egyptian control in Canaan included the coastal land south of the free city-state of Ugarit, until the 14th century BC, when Ugarit was brought under their control. Egyptian control in Canaan began to wane during the reign of Akhenaten, who neglected his imperial holdings because he was pursuing religious reforms. Now, Akhenaten's religious reforms were about the practice of Atonism. The idea that he alone can intercede with the god Aten, who was the only god being worshipped, and the rest of the Egyptian pantheon was kind of pushed away. It's important to understand that in pagan religions, there is no concept of proselytization the way we think of other religions such as Christianity and Islam. Instead, there was the idea that religion was a technology and should only be confined to the elites who would disseminate it down to the common people. And bringing in foreign elements to that process was seen as very undesirable. The Hittite Empire was also in the process of expanding to the south during this time, and the Egyptians lost many cities to them, such as Megiddo. The result of these conflicts, which peaked at the Battle of Kadesh, was that many of the strategically valuable cities and those along the northern front became militarized seats of Egyptian power for Egyptian commanders. Evidence of this Egyptian militarization comes in the change in style of pottery, the discovery of Egyptian stone governing offices, and the discovery of preserved battlements and fortifications from the corresponding strata. The withdrawal of the Egyptian Empire from Canaan occurred in stages between 1150 and 1120 BC during the 20th dynasty. Okay, quick note on the Battle of Kadesh. The conflict between the Hittites and the Egyptians in the Battle of Kadesh is reported by both sides' sources as a exceptional victory. Okay, this for propaganda purposes. This has caused archaeologists to have to disregard those accounts and rely on only archaeology from the region in order to discover who actually won the battle. It's a very contentious subject in the scholarship. Now, for our next point, who were the Sea Peoples? Sea Peoples being a group of pirates who raided on the Egyptian Mediterranean coast towards the end of the Bronze Age. These people were made up of three groups: the Philistines, the Libyans, and Mycenaean Greeks, who worked together to profit from raiding on the Egyptian coast and eventually making their way up the Canaanite Mediterranean coast. The settling of the Philistines and other sea peoples on the southern coast of Canaan has traditionally been used as the dividing point between the end of the late Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age, which coincides with the rise of ancient Israel. Because the majority of these early iron artifacts in Canaan are either made by the Sea Peoples or imitations of their original design. The corresponding date of circa 1200 BC should therefore be moved back to at least 1150 BC to reflect the fact that the social effects of iron smelting were not to be fully felt by native Canaanite civilization until after the Egyptians had completely retreated from their territory. The last pharaoh to rule over Canaan was either Ramses V or Ramses VI. The use of the term Sea Peoples in Egyptian primary sources refers to the nomadic maritime tribes who migrated south into Canaan during the latter part of Egyptian occupation. They raided as pirates in coalition with the Libyans against Egypt in the 20th dynasty. When they were defeated by the Egyptians, the pharaoh pressed them into service in the garrisons established on the coast of what would become Philistia. The Phoenicians most likely came to dominate the Mediterranean trade through collaboration with the Sea Peoples. Tubb records that during their raids, the tribes of the Sea Peoples at circa 1200 BC, they destroyed many Levantine coastal cities, including Ugarit, before moving on to Egypt. However, the neighboring port cities of Tyre, Byblos, and Sidon remained untouched during the same period. The coastal area south of Tel Sucus, which contained these ports, is first referred to as Phoenicia around the time of Israel's wars with the Philistines. Their name comes from the Greek word for purple, phoenikes, which refers to the dye collected from native snails, which became their most famous commodity. By 1150 BC, the Hittite Empire had collapsed, and the Egyptian occupation in Canaan had ended, leaving a power vacuum in the area. This vacuum was filled in Canaan by the emergence of three distinct cultures, which included the Aramaeans on the Syrian border, the Philistines in the southern coastal plain, and the Israelite kingdom between them. The Aramaeans represent a new linguistic group in Syria. Although culturally they emerged out of earlier Bronze Age cultures related to the Amorites around Aleppo, Damascus, and Hamath, they did not arrive as an invading force. Now, before we continue, what is a tell in the context of archaeology? A tell is a man-made hill that is created by continuous urban inhabitation over the course of continuous settlements where cities are built on top of other cities. So it creates a hill with strata representing each of the cities where they were demolished and the next city was built on top of them. So these represent the strata and the general hill structure. Now, to discuss the ancestral skull cult. In the city of Jericho, from its material culture dating to the pre-pottery Neolithic phase around 7200 BC, was a high-walled city with circular mud brick houses and a tall stone tower. The culture inhabiting it during this phase participated in a sophisticated ancestor cult. Believers would bury their deceased beneath the floorboards and later exhume the skull, replacing it with a clay structure. The skull was usually plastered, painted, or in some way decorated to recapture a semblance of human features. These skulls presumably became the relics used by the family in their cult practices. Canaan had several similar cities during the 8th millennium BC with skull relic ancestor cults, as well as from the 6th millennium to about the middle of the 5th millennium, Jericho and these others experienced a decline to unwalled settlements. The cause has been attributed to an influx of various villages whose different style of pottery presupposed competition. We will be returning to this theme of the ancestor skull cult in our first lecture on Ugarit next week. Changes in burial customs. Changes in burial customs. Burial customs during the early Bronze Age, circa 3300 BC, developed distinct characteristics from the Neolithic ancestor cult practices. In Jericho, again, whereas the previous custom had been to inter the deceased beneath the floor of the house, now tombs separate from the home were becoming common because of the increase in population. So this idea of the larger the population gets, the more removed the center of cult practice becomes in the city-state, is built on the idea that ancestral skull practices began with migration patterns. So nomadic people would go on pilgrimage to the grave sites of their ancestors to, engage in their religious practices. Over time, as they settled, they began interring the ancestors beneath the home. As populations grew and land became scarce, they had to move the locus of the cult practices away into a graveyard where the land could be reserved for multiple interments. The increase in population came from the invention of a more sophisticated reservoir and irrigation technologies. These tombs were typically family-owned and rock cut so that many generations could be interred over time. Typically, in each new burial, the skull would be removed from the previous burial, whose remains would then be swept aside, and the skulls used to line the walls of the tomb itself. Many of the tombs in Jericho contained well over 100 individuals. Therefore, there is also movement in space of the reliquary from the home to the tomb. Canaanite burials dated to after the collapse of the Egyptian Old Kingdom tend to be single interment burials. This development shows that in a semi-nomadic pastoral society, there was an increase in the value given to individual sacred places when compared to the generations of tradition associated with earlier family tombs, which had higher reverence for the family unit's collective sacred place, as opposed to just one individual. The urban settlements in southern Canaan begin to see an increase in population again during the reign of Pharaoh Mentuhotep, the first pharaoh of the Middle Kingdom. Which led to a reestablishment of the earlier trade routes. The prevalence of rock-cut family tombs in southern settlements from the Middle Bronze Age confirms this increase in population. Bigger families in richer times needed family tombs when land is scarce. Population increases, land becomes more scarce, they need to regulate burials in a new way. The grave discovered at Tel Saadiya, which date from the late 13th to the middle 12th centuries BC, show the existence of a much more ancient cemetery beneath it. These graves show how older bodies were dealt with when a new burial needed to occur when land was scarce. The skull was exhumed, sometimes with one or two long bones, and reburied in a separate location. It was not uncommon, therefore, for several other skulls to be discovered in the grave of a single individual. This shows continuation of past ideas about the holiness of the skulls of the ancestors, but in a more indirect form. Evolution of temple architecture. Recall the condemnation of high places or stone circles called Bama in Hebrew. The primary evolution of Canaanite temples moves from the Bama to the Masabot to the Migdol. The Bible makes references to the Canaanites using Bama as their place of worship, meaning hilly places where megaliths were set up, basically stone circles on top of hills. These correspond to the oldest courtyard altars constructed at En Gedi, but there is no correspondence in the Bible for the Migdol, which was an innovation brought in by people from what is today Armenia. The Chalcolithic period is principally identified with the Gassel Beersheba culture, which distinguished itself by the construction of a prominent cult center external to the home. Their temple, located at En Gedi, had a single large room with benches against the walls and a sophisticated altar which was equipped with vessels for receiving burnt offerings and a position for the cult statue. The wall paintings of the buildings associated with the temple at En Gedi, the Armenoid structure of the area's human remains, and the ceremonial objects discovered at nearby Nahal Hemar all indicate that this period of development was brought on by immigrants from the Caucasus. These immigrants brought with them the knowledge of smelting arsenical copper, which boosted the economy, but that their later cultural influence overall was very limited because of the art styles that still retain their native features, which was found there. The new type of temple constructed commonly during the Middle Bronze Age was the Migdol, or fortress type, which can be identified by its thick walls and narrow hallway that connects the anteroom to the sanctuary, which always had an elevated ceiling. Some sites also had flanking towers containing stairwells. This style of temple has been found preserved in many places, such as Megiddo and as far away as Ebla in Syria. Now, the city of Ebla in Syria is important in the context of biblical archaeology. Ebla. Okay. While Ebla does not have sophisticated mythological poetry or epic poetry as found there, what it does have is trade documents that do two things. First, they identify as a trading partner the city of Sodom, and the first use outside the Bible of documenting using Israel as a given name. Which are both land-breaking discoveries for the verification of passages from the Bible from pre-exilic times. I'd like to thank you again for tuning into this video, and that is the conclusion of